I've been asked to talk about the economics of the drought. Now, the drought is a dry subject any way you think about it. I know, that's bad, wasn't it? And economics is not exactly exciting. In fact, economists are sometimes described as people who are good with numbers but don't have the personality to be an accountant. But we're going to do the best we can to try to do this. And to do that, we're going to have to do some heavy lifting here a little bit and really talk about some economics along the way and some politics, because they get all balled up there. And basically, what's happened over time is between the economics and the politics, we pretty much made a mess out of water and water policy. And I'm going to try to explain some of that and kind of see where we might be going, how it impacts people, that sort of thing. And as I say, some of it will get a little heavy, I suppose, but bear with me. It all starts out with kind of a fundamental yin and yang that goes on inside some of us and certainly across people. And that is, we view water in two completely different ways. In one sense, it's viewed as almost something sacred and something that should be enjoyed by all species, that we all have a right to. It's almost in our DNA to care very deeply about water and to respect water. Most great civilizations were found around water. Whether you go to the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, or you go to the Nile, or the Amazon, or the Congo, or the Yangtze, or the Indus, or the Mississippi, it doesn't matter. Most civilizations started around bodies of water because of navigation and because of sustenance, and the fact that, and particularly when they became domesticated, could grow crops and that sort of thing, water was absolutely essential, and so we kind of formed our world around water. The other view is that it's a commodity, and it's something to be bought and sold and traded and used and that sort of thing, and those two kind of compete with each other, and that's, I think, part of why water policy sometimes gets messed up. And when you start talking about the economics and politics, water really is different than a lot of other things. It's not the same as land, which is its major counterpart on the earth. It's not the same as food, clothing, shelter, some of the other things that we view as necessities in life. There's some real genuine economic differences there, and I'll talk about those. And also, because we feel differently about water, we've kind of evolved some institutions over time, for better or for worse, that treat water a little bit differently. And so I'm going to kind of try to put all that together into something that makes sense, and hopefully I'll succeed. The first thing I got to talk about in terms of economics is value. Because how do we value water? How do we value things in general in economics? Because that's kind of where the whole issue starts. And most people might say, well, it's the price. Well, it's really not. I mean, price can be the value. There's some things for which price is probably the value. For example, a share of common stock. You can buy one of them, 100 of them, 1,000 of them, pay about the same price, doesn't matter. That's on that given day, that's probably about the right value for that particular share of stock. But for a lot of things, price isn't really the value. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But if you think about it, there's all kinds of things out there that are not in the market. They don't have a price, but they have a value. Your health, a nice sunset. You know, all those things are things we value, we have some tie to. And like most economists, I'll start out with Adam Smith, because he kind of wrote our book, The Wealth of Nations, back in 1776, which kind of laid out how markets are supposed to work and that sort of thing. And he was fascinated by water. And when he talked about value, he used what he called the paradox between diamonds and water. He said, diamonds don't do that much of anything. They have very limited use for anything, but they cost a lot of money. And water is something you absolutely have to have. It's absolutely essential, and it's essentially free. And you know, why is that? And he separated into the value of something in its use versus its value in exchange. And he wasn't the first person to do this. He kind of made it a little more explicit than some others, but Plato figured this out. He wrote that water was the best commodity there was and the least expensive. So the ancient Greeks figured this out. Aristotle figured out that things can have two different values, one in how you use them, which he called the proper value, and one in how you exchange them, which he called the improper value. I'm not sure I'd agree with the proper improper thing, but he had the concept down. And there was another really smart guy back in the 1300s named St. Thomas Aquinas. And you hear about him a lot for his religious writings, but the guy was really smart. And he wrote a lot of economics too. He didn't mean to, he just did. And the reason he ended up writing economics was back in those days, just way before capitalism became a dominant thing, and people's main goal in life wasn't to maximize profits or maximize wealth or that kind of thing. It was pretty much to get into heaven. And so if they did something wrong, even by accident, they wanted to make sure they made the right restitution. And he wrote a lot of stuff about what's the right restitution. If you accidentally damage somebody's property, what's the proper restitution? Well, to do that, he really had to think about value and prices and that sort of thing. And some of his writings in the 1300s are not that much different than the way we think about these things today. And he gave water kind of a divine value. But nonetheless, what it came down to was it was very, very important but very cheap. So a lot of people figured this out. The reason and Adam Smith had this was something called scarcity. Diamonds relative to how we value them are pretty scarce. You don't find many 10-carat perfect diamonds. Water, it's not all that scarce, generally speaking. And so consequently, that's kind of what was going on. Fast forward a little bit. Any hydrologist in the room? Okay. Ever heard of Dupuyt's assumption? You have, okay. Guy in the 1850s, born in Italy, raised in France. It didn't matter. Napoleon was in charge of all of them at that time. But anyway, a guy named Jules Dupuyt in the 1850s was a really smart guy. And he did a lot of stuff in hydrology and a little bit in economics too. And he figured out that basically, he's famous in hydrology because he said, nobody knows exactly what happens when you pour water out. But if you just kind of assume it's going to spread out horizontally and start with that, you can probably figure out what you need to figure out. I mean, that's a reasonable summary of his assumption. But in economics, he figured out it's that we pay for the last unit. We pay for the marginal unit of something. For example, if you go to the grocery store and you buy 5 loaves of bread, what that says is at the price they're charging now, you wanted 5 of them. If they charge more, you might have only bought 3. But you bought 5 at the price it was. That meant that's how much you wanted. That last unit was worth what you paid for it. The others, you actually got a little gravy out of it. You would have paid a little more to get those, and you didn't have to. And that's a concept that later a prominent economist at Cambridge in the late 1800s named Alfred Marshall started calling consumer surplus. That is, we get to pay for the last unit. So what we pay for water, if you're a consumer in a household, for example, you're not paying for that first gallon that keeps you alive. You're paying for that part that runs down the faucet when you're brushing your teeth, or that part that's left over when you mop the floor. You get to pay the price for that last part of the water you use, not the first part of the water you use. In fact, if I wanted to be very, very wealthy, if I could figure out a way to sell you just the water you had to have to survive, I could get wealthy with just the folks in this room, because you'd pretty much give me a whole lot of money if I had the key to keeping you alive. I could pretty much charge anything I wanted to. But obviously that's not what we pay for water. We pay a lot less than that for water. And so anyway, that's kind of how the whole thing evolved. After Marshall kind of laid all this out and talked about it and how it was a use value, but it was an incremental value and it's marginal, and we got this kind of gravy surplus out of it, then people kept studying that and thinking about it for years and years and years, and you get into the 1900s and we started figuring out a little more fancy math to do with marginal stuff. Then we started talking about other ways we might measure it. We came up with something called the maximum willingness to pay versus the minimum you would accept in a transaction. And those numbers aren't exactly the same, so that led us to talk about bargaining. And if any of you saw the movie a few years ago, A Beautiful Mind, I don't know if you saw it, it was a big movie, won Academy Awards. Russell Crowe played John Nash. John Nash was the guy that kind of came up with all that stuff. Anyway, we get to this point where we're studying all this stuff about commodities and value and that sort of thing. And then we start talking about, well, we've always said things like a sunset have value. Things like your health have value. Maybe we can figure out ways to measure that value. And this was going on a lot in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Economists were really studying on this. And they came up with some ways to measure them in monetary terms. And, a sunset's one thing, your health, but it's also things like, and now I'm about to get personal here, a species or a habitat. You kind of see where this is going now as we start getting into water policy and water law and all those kinds of things. Those things, because all of those are kind of things that you don't trade them in the market, but they obviously have some value to people. And you also get into issues like the value to an individual versus the value to society. And sometimes the value to society can be a whole lot on something, and the value to a single individual not that much. All those things get into play there. And one other concept that we came up with about the same time, a guy named Paul Samuelson, who was a very good economist. In fact, he died a few years ago, lived a very long life, a Nobel Prize winner. I was pleased to do one of his eulogies. But his son, Robert Samuelson, writes a column in some of the newspapers. You may see it now. His nephew, Robert Summers, was recently President Obama's chief economic advisor. He's been president of Harvard. He's in the newspapers a lot. They thought he might be Fed chairman, but he didn't get to be. So anyway, prominent family, but really smart guy. He came up with another distinction between a public good and a private good. Now, there's some goods we consume just for our own selves. Some are public goods. And to be a public good, it has to be something that doesn't have rivalry in consumption. Like that loaf of bread I was talking about a minute ago. If you buy it, I don't get to buy it. So there's rivalry there. One of us gets it, the other one doesn't get it. And also, you can't exclude people from it. In other words, if you buy the bread, I don't get to have the bread. So a good example would be national defense, okay? Public art, a pristine lake. If I get just as much defense as you get. It's not like if I get defended by the Army and the Navy, you don't get defended. There's no rivalry there. There's no excluding anybody. And I pay some taxes, but it doesn't matter. Somebody that doesn't pay some taxes also gets the same defense. I mean, we're all getting protected by the same Army, Navy, and that sort of thing, even though we pay different amounts for it and that sort of thing. And so we tend to underconsume public goods, underproduce public goods. And the reason we underproduce them is some people get to be free riders. Like the folks who don't pay any taxes, they still get national defense. They still get to look at public art. They still get to go to the park. They still get to go to the public lake. So, people can use it, so everybody doesn't pay what it's worth to them, so we don't produce as much of that stuff as we might like to. Now, water is both. And that's one of the things that makes water kind of tricky. It's a public good and a private good. It's a public good when it's in a river, when it's in a stream, when it's sometimes when it's in a lake, depending on who owns the lake and that sort of thing. The water that's in your pipes in your house that you're drinking is a private good. You paid something to buy that water, and you get to use that water. And so there's a distinction there, and the public good part of it has led to something in common law. It started in ancient Rome, and we still have it today in certain British common law, U.S. common law, that when you're talking about rivers and streams and that sort of thing, everybody can use the water, but nobody owns the water. You don't have ownership of those kinds of things. And that's a concept that's been around for quite a while. Now, water is mobile. That's another thing that makes it different from, say, land, for example. Water is very mobile. That is, it seeps, it runs, it evaporates, it gets reused. I mean, it goes all over the place. And because of that, we've also evolved a concept in law that's called riparian water rights. And that's kind of one that says if you're on the stream, everybody can take some, but nobody can take all. And out in the West, particularly the far West, in other drier times when there's been less water than they needed, they even put in another concept that was basically, a short way to say it is, if you got there first, you get it. First in time is first in rights. And then now that's water that flows free. Groundwater has an entirely different legal structure behind it. Groundwater, historically, you can get the groundwater under your property. In some places, like where I live in Texas, you actually own the groundwater that you can drill for and get on your property. In Oklahoma, you don't own it, but you have the exclusive right to take it. The only difference that makes is in how the lawsuits are worded. I mean, essentially, it works the same way. Okay, either way. If you can drill for it below your land, you can get it. And if you don't slant the well or something, and it happens to flow off somebody else's property and you got there first, that's okay. I mean, as long as you don't do anything crooked to get it, if you drill on your land, you could have that water. So we've had all those kind of things evolve over time. with water, and you know, it's just all those things are very different from land. In addition to being mobile and flowing around, it's also variable in its quantities, and that's a lot of what Evelyn was talking about earlier. It varies over time. It varies over space. It varies over time. We can deal with that with storage. It varies over space. We can deal with that with interbasin transfers. But in essence, it's something that has a lot of variability to it. And that's also something that's unlike most land, food, water, shelter, the other kind of necessities that we find out there. So all of these things, you know, make water different. And as Evelyn pointed out, back in the 50s, we did a lot of storing. And we'd gone through our industrial revolution in the early part of the century, and we had, you know, properly stored water, that sort of thing. Over time, we've kind of evolved some institutions that have made that more difficult to do. So now, as that infrastructure wears out, we haven't done what we need to replenish some of it, and that's what's happening now. And that's part of what we have to address as we talk about water policy, and I'll try to talk about that in just a few minutes. So anyway, that's and the other weird thing about water is its use is intermittent. Now, a lot of things are intermittent. We use less air conditioning in less electricity in the winter than we do the summer. Certainly in the spring than we do the summer. You know, I mean, that's kind of a given. But water is really intermittent. For example, a lot of irrigated areas, there's places where you use it very, very, very intensely for 75, 90 days or something, then not at all the rest of the year. California basically receives 80% of their water rainfall and restoration in the fall and the winter, and uses 80% of their water in the spring and the summer. And so you've got these all kinds of things like that create just difficulties in managing it, and things that make it different economically. It's a different breed of commodity than everything else. And so that's kind of a little bit of the economics behind it. Like I say, I apologize for kind of going in the weeds a little bit there. Let me stop economics. I'll come back to it, but let me stop economics for a minute now and talk about the politics and the institutions, because I think that's very, very important when you start trying to understand water and understand the economics behind water. First of all, a little bit of history in terms of water policy in this century. If you go back to 1902, we had the River and Harbor Act. It appointed a board of engineers, and it told them to consider the commercial impacts of water projects. That was kind of the first time anybody sort of in a formal structure in this country put anything about economics and water in the same place. Fast forward a few years to 1920, we amend and revise and extend the River and Harbor Act, and we put in something about not only considering the commercial aspects of it, but considering them locally and generally. That's because by that time, Congress had discovered something called cost sharing. And they felt like the local areas that got the most benefit should pay for part of it. And all the things you see now where you have regional cooperation and regions working with the federal government or a state government to try to do something, all that kind of emerged from that notion that started in 1920. Then in 1934, the Water Resources Board at that time appointed a new committee, and they said, we want you to do social and private accounting on water projects. So all of a sudden now we're going to look at benefits of that non-market stuff I was talking about. You know, stuff that's not on the market, not just commercial activity, but social accounting, things that society benefits from that not necessarily get in the market, have a market value. And then a couple of years later, in 1936, something really interesting happened. We passed the Flood Control Act, and it involved the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm starting to get stuff that should be very familiar now. And it said that the Corps of Engineers could be involved in any project where the benefits to whomever they accrue exceed the estimated cost. The benefits to whomever they accrue exceed the estimated cost. Now, these two things, these last two happened in 1934 and 1936. What was going on then in the country? Yeah, the Great Depression. You also had some drought issues as well. But the Great Depression was going on in 1934, 1936. And the attitude of the government at the time was, under President Roosevelt, we need to be building stuff just to put people to work. We need to be doing big public works projects just to put people to work. And a lot of the water storage projects that we built that helped us out in the 50s came about because of what we did in that time period, because Civilian Conservation Corps, Works Progress Administration, all those things, let's build something. Let's put some people to work. We built some big dams back then. We built some other things back then that were very important to our water storage capacity. We built a lot of reservoirs back then. Because think about those words, okay? First of all, the idea is to build a lot of stuff. So they said if the benefits exceed the estimated cost, okay? Now, what does that tell you they're probably going to do with the estimated cost? They're going to underestimate it because they want to build a lot of stuff, okay? The benefits to whomever they accrue. All of a sudden that means not just the farmers and ranchers, not just the cities and the water they pump into the cities, but also benefits of things like recreation and things of that nature. And so all of a sudden you could look at all kinds of stuff when you're trying to say, do the benefits exceed the cost? It opened up a whole new field called cost-benefit analysis. We'd never done that before. Economists hadn't thought about it. But all of a sudden we started thinking about it. And the reason is, now that it was a legal thing and you're supposed to do it, you could get grants to study it. And if you want to get academics thinking about something, you tell them, here's where the grant money is. And all of a sudden that becomes the most important thing they can think about. And so we started thinking a lot about cost-benefit analysis in the economics field and trying to measure some of these things. And they kept writing guidelines and trying to come up with things. Finally, in 1950, they published something the Corps published something called the Green Book, which was kind of the guideline for how you studied these projects to see if they made sense. And that was kind of the Bible, and it gets revised and extended from time to time. Well, about the same time, this same guy I mentioned earlier, Paul Samuelson, who's a really smart guy, came up with a new idea about how we might talk about consumption in general, not just water, but anything. It was a theory called revealed preference. Okay? And the idea behind revealed preference is very simple. If I want to know how you spend your money, there's a couple of ways I can do it. The old traditional way was I can ask you. Get you to fill out a survey or to talk to me or whatever and say, how much do you spend on this? How much do you spend on that? What do you do and that sort of thing. The other thing I can do is I can go watch you spend money. And if I see what you spend, you have revealed to me your preferences because you've taken the money you had available and you spent it the way you wanted to spend it, and this is what you bought. And that's called revealed preference. If I can observe spending patterns, and about that time the Bureau of Labor Statistics started doing big analysis and all that of how people spend their money and that sort of thing. We started getting data on that and started working on it. Well, about 1956, the National Park Service decided they would like to measure what was the value of the national parks to the country, the economic value, put a dollar term on the value of the national parks. And they wrote a bunch of famous economists and said, how would you do that? Well, we're a pretty lazy lot on the whole. And all of them but one wrote back and said, it's too hard, don't even try. Okay. But one guy named Harold Hotelling, who's a smart economist, I knew him much later in his life before he died, but he, very smart economist, he said, you know what you can do? You can kind of use this new revealed preference thing we're doing. See how much money people spend to come to national parks. They have to travel, they have to stay in hotels, they have to buy gasoline or airfare, they have to buy food. Figure out how much they're spending to come to national parks, and that's revealing their preference for national parks. Okay? And so they started gathering data from people who came to national parks and getting data from the vendors around national parks and that sort of thing. And that's well, that didn't really happen right away because the National Park Service said that's too hard. And so they wrote a report that said most economists say you can't do it. Okay? Well, fast forward a couple of years, and the California State Water Project, they wanted to do a big water project in California, and they decided they want to justify it by these kind of benefits, besides just farmers and ranchers and cities and that sort of thing. They want to figure out the benefit of having more lakes and that sort of thing. Well, they remember this letter. They've read about it. And so they hire some folks to actually go do that. And what they did was they went to some other lakes in the Sierra Nevadas that were comparable to these lakes they were going to build. And they started collecting this data. And they figured out how to do it. And that became known as the travel cost method. Go figure, okay? But anyway, a couple of years later, Resources for the Future decided that they would do it for the National Park Service, even though they didn't do it for themselves. They wanted to know what the answer was, so they got it done. That would happen in the late 50s. By the mid-60s, 7 or 8 of these things had been done, and it made the Green Book. This is like an okay way to do this now. We like this. The problem with it was, if you want to call it a problem, that doesn't measure the total value that these things have to people, that these resources have to people. And the reason is there's value beyond what people pay to go see it. There's something called the option value. You know, I've never been there, but I'd like to have the chance to go if I ever wanted to. So I don't want it to go away. You might pay a little bit for that. You know, a lot of us probably, at least some of us probably send a few bucks every year to save the rainforest or whatever. And it's not like we're going to go down to the Amazon and spend a lot of time there, but we just want to be there, you know. And then there's something called the bequest value. I don't think I'll ever care anything about this national park over here, but I want my kids and grandkids to be able to go to it if they want to. And yeah, I'd pay a little bit of money to keep it there. So that's another way you can put value on it. And then there's one they call the existence value. I don't care anything about seeing it. I don't think my kids would care. I don't think my grandkids would care. But I think it's great that part of the American wilderness is being preserved. And I think just because it exists, that's worth something to me. And a lot of people feel that way. And you know, if they get a mailer or something else, send a few bucks in. So there's all these other things that can get lumped into the value there. And by the 70s, the economists figured out a way to measure this. We had to do some fancy surveys and then do some fancy math with the surveys. It became known as contingent valuation, like valuing the contingency, the option, the bequest, the existence. And we figured out ways that we could do that worked pretty well. And by the 70s, those had made the Green Book, along with the travel cost method. So that was an okay thing to do. But what really changed it all happened about the same time. In 1969, we passed something called the National Environmental Policy Act. That was the one, it was one of our major pieces of environmental legislation that was passed in the Nixon administration. He passed more environmental legislation than anybody, as some people don't realize that, but in the Nixon administration. And it created something called environmental impact statements. Oh, yeah. Thought I'd get your attention. And what it says is, anytime you're going to do a big public project, you got to figure out not only all the other economics, but the environmental impact as well. So from that point forward, when people do studies, by the time we get to the mid-70s, everybody that's doing a study is studying environmental effects as well as all the other economic effects. And a real watershed moment in that, no pun intended, but a real watershed moment in that was in 1993 with something called the Morrill Lake Project in California. And the reason that one is so significant is, and means so much in what we're talking about here, is in that one, they diverted some hydropower from LA that represented about 8% of LA's power. They diverted it in order to save a habitat. That was the first time they'd actually done it. They had talked about it and measured it and all that kind of stuff. But in 1993, we actually had a project where they said, the highest and best use of our resources on this is to protect this habitat over here. So when we build this lake, that's what we're going to do. And even though it took a substantial amount of power away from California, and California hadn't exactly been flush with power for a long time, they felt it was more important to preserve the habitat. From that point forward, every reservoir we tried to build, every major project we deal with, there's an aspect of it that is both reclamation cost and mitigation cost in addition to the actual cost of the project itself. Now, there's good and bad about that. You know, you can argue it either way, and I'm not here to express a position, but the end result of it was it made projects more expensive to do, which meant less would get done. It made the process more cumbersome, which meant it would take longer. So as some of these projects we built in the 30s that gave us water in the 50s began to wear out, we weren't replacing fast enough to have the resources we needed if something happened. Now, there is a silver lining to this. And the silver lining is you not only get to count the environmental habitats and species and all that, you get to count everything. So you also get to count the recreational value of the lake, any ecotourism it might generate. So you get to count not just the farmers and ranchers and cities and that sort of thing. You get to count all this other stuff too. So you get to count more positive in terms of generating water resources, but the negative that can take away from those resources and move into another use of some type, preserving a habitat or something of that nature. So it's kind of a balancing act that's going on there. So that's kind of the institutional framework we find ourselves in right now, by and large. It varies a little bit from state to state and that sort of thing, but by and large, that's a big overview. I hope that's somewhat useful. Then we need to talk about a couple more things about water, and then we can talk about where we are now and kind of where this whole thing shakes out. First of all, we need to talk about the cost of water. Okay? Basically, water resources are very, very capital intensive. And the cost for water to, like, say, for example, build a water pipeline, the cost relative to the revenue you receive from the water is much, much more, the ratio is much higher for the cost to the revenue than it is for, say, natural gas. About twice, the ratio is about twice what it is for natural gas. It's about 1.7, 1.8 what it is for electricity or for, say, telecommunications lines, that sort of thing, when you talk about transporting things. Now, what that means is we don't build as much of it. It's a more expensive relative revenue, so we don't build as much of it. Okay? And as a result of that, the way these things function, even though they're all kind of necessities in today's world, is very different. For example, if there's a shortage of power today in Oklahoma City for some reason, we got a grid out there, and in a very short period of time, very, very short period of time, we can move electricity from 1,000 miles from here if we need to on that grid and get it here. But if we have a sudden shortage of water today, one of two things happens. If we've stored enough, we can use that. If we haven't, we can ration. There's not a way to instantaneously bring more water in. We can either have it stored or we can ration it. In the 50s, we had it stored. Today, we don't have so much of it stored anymore because of some of these institutions and economics and other things that kind of evolved in the whole thing. And so that's so that's one thing about the cost. The other thing is, as I say, it's very capital intensive to build water resource, whatever it might be, whether it's a reservoir, pipeline, doesn't matter. Water resources are very capital intensive. They're immobile. You can't pick them up and move them somewhere else, like you can a drilling rig or something like that. They're subject to enormous economies of scale. And what we mean by that is economies of scale simply means it costs way less than twice as much to build one twice as big. In other words, there's a lot of startup costs involved. And so, like if you're going to build a dam that's 1 mile wide or 2 miles wide, you don't double the cost. Basically, if you build bigger at first, it's going to be cheaper in the long run. And that's another characteristic that these water resources have. And so, consequently, we have a situation where it becomes something that's pretty much provided by the public sector because it has a very high fixed cost. And, of course, as we talked about, a very low marginal cost once you have the infrastructure in place and the water's kind of flowing. So the end result is that we don't, the public sector has provided. I mean, we would not, it couldn't work if we each had to build our own dam to get water, or we each had to have our own big storage facility, and that wouldn't work. We have to, it's a shared resource in that sense. It makes sense to be provided by the public sector, and that's all well and good, but a couple of things happen. One is developing water resources tends to be lumpy. And by that, or probably a better name is gigantic. It's just probably a better name. Because once you build this stuff, it lasts a long time. 50 years, 100 years, a lot longer than, say, manufacturing capital lasts or oil and gas exploration capital lasts. It lasts a long time when you build this stuff. And so once you build it, you don't build anymore for a long time. Well, then when you get ready to build it, because of these economies of scale, it doesn't make sense to build exactly what you need right now. It makes more sense to build something a lot more than you need right now and grow into it. And so it tends to be lumpy, and it tends to be very big, and hence fairly expensive. So then the public entities have to price it. And what we've done historically, always, all of us like to pay as little as we can for public goods, whether we're paying taxes or fees or whatever. What they've historically done is, although you pay by so many gallons you use, 100 gallons, 1,000 gallons, whatever, they have a rate, what they're really doing is they're not charging you for the water. They're charging you to capture the cost of building the infrastructure. They're charging you enough that if you use the amount of water you think, well, they'll be able to service the debt on the bonds or pay for the facility, however it is they financed it. And so they're really not charging you for the water. Now, that's very different than a lot of things. If you buy oil that's produced on public lands, you pay for the oil. If you buy coal that's produced on public lands, you pay for the coal. But if you buy water that comes from a public resource, they rarely charge you for the water itself. They normally just charge you the cost of the infrastructure, which means they're kind of undercharging you from the beginning a little bit. The other thing they do is they do historical replacement cost, because that's the cheapest thing to do. We just built this thing, so we're going to charge you what it takes, to pay off the bonds. They don't think about replacement cost. So 50 years, 60 years, 70 years from now, when this thing is at capacity and it's time to expand again, they hadn't built up a reserve for the next thing. Okay? So if they build something big and new, your rates are going to go way up at one time. You're not going to like that. Politicians aren't going to like that. And we also now are in this kind of fiscal thing, particularly in the West. Most of our western states are in this kind of fiscal thing right now where it is just anti-American to raise revenue. We just don't want to raise revenue for anything. Somehow we've stumbled onto the best amount of revenue you could possibly have right now. We don't raise, no matter how much the population grows, no matter how much the economy grows, we don't want to raise revenue for anything. So when it comes time for these projects, we don't have the political will to do them like we should, and so we don't do enough. I'll give you a really good example from my home state of Texas right now. We have been in this drought. We have the fastest growing population in the country. Over 1,000 people a day are added to the Texas population for the last 15 years. I mean, it's huge, exploding. A lot of economic growth. You've all read about it. Probably what you read is it's all because of Rick Perry. We might dispute that a little bit, but nonetheless. Anyway, his wife used to work for me. We're good friends, but anyway. But in any case, when we went into the last legislative session last January, water was the top priority. The Speaker of the House says we are going to solve the water problem this session. We had some estimates from our Water Development Board that we needed about $60 billion in resources to deal with our water problems. Okay? By the time the session was over, what they managed to do was they managed to pass a bill. We got something called a rainy day fund in Texas. And there's a formula that puts severance tax money in it from oil and gas. So it's got a bunch of money in it right now. They're just sitting there, not doing anything. About $10 billion or so just sitting there. Because Lord knows we couldn't spend it on education or anything like that. We got to let it sit there. Okay? So what they did was they finally voted, well, let's take $2 billion out of the rainy day fund and move it into a water fund. But they were afraid to pass that because that'd be spending money. So what they did was they passed a bill instead that said, we will let the voters vote on whether or not they want to take this money out or not out of the rainy day fund. We're not going to pass it. That way we can say we didn't vote for it. We just said, well, you could choose. Well, we voted 80-20 for it. I think people have enough sense to know they need water. It wasn't like a rocket science. But we passed it 80-20. So that's the most they could do is take money that's sitting here in an account, and if the voters said it was okay, move it over. Well, that gave us $2 billion. That's good. Sure beats nothing. But it's not a recurring source. It doesn't come year after year after year. It's not enough money. And they pat themselves on the back and say, boy, we solved the water problem. You should have seen the commercials. We just had a primary last week. All incumbents, man, we took care of the water problem. Y'all ought to vote for us. We let you vote to take 1/30 of the money you need that we already had sitting over here in the bank and put it over here. Man, vote for us. We're great. So anyway, so the point being, governments right now, particularly in the West, because by and large the Western states are in this mode politically, and frankly some of them are having financial problems. Those of us blessed with enough oil revenue are kind of doing okay right now. But in any case, we don't have the political will to build the resources that need to be built. So the situation we had in the 50s where you have a drought and you got all the water stored, we're not creating that infrastructure for the next round. Okay? So all that's happening. And not only that, when you come to water costs, we talk about, they price it too low. Ag water is priced even lower, a lot lower. And there's reasons for that. A lot of people say, yeah, it's those government subsidies. That's part of it, about 10%. Okay? The rest of it is the water's not treated as much. It's not in irrigation water is not in a system that's available on demand, pressurized, and treated in the same way that other water is. And most irrigation infrastructure is even older than the pipes that go to our house. So we paid for it a long time ago. So there's historical reasons why it's cheap, but it's cheap. Okay, so that's the cost side. Basically, right now, water it costs a lot. It's priced cheaply, and then a couple of other things that always come up when you talk about water. One of them is it's essential. That's absolutely true. It's essential. Nobody denies that. Need water, but that has absolutely nothing to do with the price we pay for water, because we consume over 100 times what's essential. We're not setting the price based on what's essential. Like I said earlier, we're setting the price based on that stuff that runs down the drain when you're brushing your teeth or stays in the mop bucket when you're finished. That last water that we don't care that much about, that's where the price is set. So unless you're an emerging, developing country that's just now getting water resources for the first time, what you're paying for it has nothing to do with the fact it's essential. So we like to say that when we're arguing about water. Say, oh, water's essential. Well, yeah, it is, but that doesn't have anything to do with how much it costs right now. It really doesn't. Okay, then one other thing about water that's interesting, in addition to being cheap, it obviously it's variable. It's different locations, quality, certainty, all kinds of stuff. But the other thing is the major argument we always use when we want to build more water resources. We say, boy, let's see them do something with this one, is economic development. Man, if we don't build our water resources, we won't have economic development. The problem you face with that argument is none of the studies that have been done on what causes economic development does water ever turn out to be what we call statistically significant, important. Now, the reason that is they do the studies wrong, and we're in the process of trying to fix that right now. Because here's what happens when you do a study of what causes economic development. You look at the outcomes and you say, okay, that's a function of a bunch of other stuff. And you put incentives, highways, cost of wage cost, transportation cost, water cost, and 2 or 3 other things. Well, water's so darn cheap that it never shows up to matter. And so all the studies say that. And the problem with that is, and this has to do with some math, and I apologize, but bear with me for a minute. When you do an equation like that, where you say economic development, what is jobs, income, output, doesn't matter, whatever how you measure it is a function of all these other things, what you're saying is each one of those things contributes, and you could substitute one for the other. In other words, if you have cheaper power, that'll make up for not quite as good a workforce, and that sort of thing. Well, as we all know, there's places where you can't substitute for water. There's certain areas of human consumption where it's essential. There's certain industry where it's essential. Paper, refining, lumber, food and beverage. More recently, was getting a lot of attention, hydraulic fracturing to get at some of the oil that's in the shale right now. So, it's not like that. So all those other things are in the category of of sort of sufficient conditions, water's in the necessary condition. You can have things that are necessary, not sufficient, or sufficient and not necessary. Water comes in the category of being necessary but not sufficient. All those other things come into the category of being sufficient but not necessary. And so the math's wrong in the way these things are set up. And we're in the process of getting that fixed, and we'll get some a little bit better results out of it. But nonetheless, all those things are happening, okay? So where do we end up? The economics is complicated. What you just listened to me on, I think you'll all agree with that. The economics is complicated. It's a very different commodity. It has different properties. It behaves differently and that sort of thing. So it's different economically. Frankly, if you paid half attention in the last 30 minutes, you know more about the economics of water than 99% of the policymakers know. Okay, because it's complicated. They hadn't bothered to dig in and learn this stuff. Okay? Then, secondly, the institutions are not the best to get done what we need to get done, because they have evolved in such a way that wants water to be very cheap right now and not think about the future. They've evolved in a way that hasn't created incentives to develop water resources like we need. They've kind of evolved in a way that's not really conducive to dealing with the situation we're facing right now. So that's kind of the economics, the institutions, and all that. So let me kind of get toward the end of what I want to say here with just some facts, and then kind of where that leaves us, okay? Here's the facts. Because we pay less for water than its real value, we overconsume it. Simple fact. Anytime you pay less for something than it's worth, so to speak, than its value, we get back to that value issue, you overconsume it. Good example of that right now, and it would take me hours and hours and hours to talk about everything that's going on in the healthcare system. I don't want to start that right now. I don't think you want me to start that right now. But here's a very, very simple issue from the healthcare system. Most of us who have insurance, who've had insurance a long time, the basic model is about an 80-20 copay. You pay 20%, insurance pays 80%, like a doctor visit. And the other money's being paid out there somewhere, but you don't really see it all the time. So let's say a visit to the doctor costs $50. That means you pay 10, and the insurance company pays 40 if it's an 80-20 copay. Okay? If you wake up in the morning and you feel $15 worth of bad, you go to the doctor. Because, man, for $10, you're going to get $15 worth of bad fixed. Well, it's costing somebody $50. And so we consume more of that than we would otherwise. Okay? And it's true of any good. I mean, if today we said, from now on, Mercedes is going to cost $10,000, what would happen? A lot more folks would have Mercedes than have them now. And that's kind of what we've done with water. We overconsume it. That's one fact. Now, let me give you another fact. I mentioned water can be reclaimed, reused, and all that kind of stuff. But when you talk about consumptive water, water is actually consumed in the process of its use. Okay? 84% of the consumptive water in the country goes to agriculture. Agriculture produces less than 1% of the gross domestic product. Not saying that's good or bad, I'm saying it's a fact. I'm just dealing with facts. 84% of the water, less than 1% of the gross output. When we talk about this drought right now, it's been going on for 3 years, and we talk about the harm it's done to the agricultural sector. We throw around numbers in the tens of billions of dollars. I've seen 50, I've seen 60, I've seen 70, I've seen one person say 100. Let's take 100, that's okay. Big one. Let's take $100 billion of damage to agriculture. That's a lot, okay? But in that 3-year period, the country has produced $50 trillion of gross product, roughly $16, $17 trillion a year in gross product. So our $100 billion of damage out of $50 trillion of production is 0.2%. In the grand scheme of the economy, we call that round-off error. Okay? I mean, it doesn't even affect the monthly growth rates enough to affect the growth rate that's reported. So despite the fact it's a huge problem, it affects a lot of you and a lot of the communities where we live dramatically. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't go on the radar screen. What gets on the radar screen is 84% of the consumptive water use. Industry uses 5%, and industry, including mining and all the fracking, consumes 5% and produces 15% of the output. So when they use 1% of the water, they do 3% of the output. 1 over 84% is what agriculture does. So it's a red flag. It gets people's attention. Now, let me mention a couple of other things that have happened along the way here. One is politics, and I will mention it from two different perspectives. One I hit on earlier. The way we budget and do spending now at the federal level and the state level is generally broken. We all talk about how Congress can't get anything done. One of the things that happened with this sequester, and I don't want to get way off on that tangent, but let me talk about it just a minute. One of the things that happened with sequester was, how that came about was when they did the deal back in 2011 to raise the debt ceiling. You never should negotiate about the debt ceiling. We have to pay our debts. But they negotiated. They came up with this thing called a sequester. And here was the idea behind it. They said, we're going to appoint this super committee. And they're going to figure out what we're going to do with the budget. And we know they'll figure it out, because if they don't, we're going to put in something absolutely stupid that nobody wants called sequester. Of course, they didn't figure it out, so we got sequester. Now some of them brag about it, but we got sequester. Well, sequester said, we're going to cut all the budgets a certain percentage. That's what you hear about sequester? Well, that's not what it really did. That's not what it really did. It cut some of the budgets by a fixed percentage. The part of the budget that's growing very rapidly, Medicare, Medicaid, all those kind of things, they're all exempt from sequester. All the money that was cut in sequester, 8% came from entitlements, which is where the growth is. 75% came from everything else. And then 16% came from, when you save all that other stuff, you save some interest. But basically 3/4 of it came from the everything else. The everything else is defense, infrastructure, education, those kinds of things. It's the things we kind of have historically wanted government to do for us. It's those public goods that are out there that we've always wanted, and always, when we made the original social contract, said, we send you some of our money, you take care of these things for us. You know, that's the kind of stuff. So those got cut by a very significant percentage. Not only that, they didn't even let them, they've changed it a little bit now, but at first they didn't even let them balance how they cut it. Like, they didn't say to the Interior Department, we're going to cut so much of your budget, figure out what to do. They said, you're going to cut this part of it this much and this part of it this much. And, well, that's silly. If you had to cut your budget at home by 5%, the most stupid thing you could do is say, well, I'm just going to cut everything 5%. What's going to happen if you pay 95% of your electric bill? They're going to cut your power off. They're not going to, you know, so you got to figure out something else. And we never get to have that, we didn't have that conversation. So anyway, all that to say, the fiscal situation, I talked about the states, federal government, is not good. There's another important political factor here, though, that I haven't talked about, and it's very important to this whole thing, and that is the population growth that is occurring in this country right now is primarily a suburban phenomenon. Most of the growth is in the areas around central cities. Rural areas are losing population. We redistrict every 10 years after the census and carve up the districts. What that means is every year in state legislatures and in Congress, rural areas are getting fewer and fewer and fewer representatives. So in the political process, you have fewer voices than you had at another point in time. So we're consuming too much. Agriculture's numbers don't look good with the 84%, 1%. The politics are messed up. And then one other thing, the law. Because the law mandates that we give very serious priority to species and habitats. Okay? So they're going to get some of the water you used to get. Okay? No question about that. Or it's not going to be produced to preserve those habitats, whatever the case may be. The other thing is, because it becomes to an economic equation now, this is where that individual versus society thing comes in. And this comes up all the time. I've been involved in several states where there's a discussion of, are we going to lower the water level in this lake where everybody likes to go boating and fishing and that sort of thing, or are we going to cut irrigation? Most of the time now, they pick cutting irrigation. And they pick cutting irrigation because, again, if you take the irrigation, it benefits the the farmers, the people who own the land, get benefit from the irrigation. But that lake, if it's worth $1 to 1 million people, that's $1 million. It's that individual versus society thing. And so that they give greater weight there. If it's a decision between irrigation or going in the city pipes, the political clout is with the city folks. And you say, well, wait a minute, we're essential. Well, all the water you use is not essential. If people were starving, you get a whole different view of this stuff. But they're not. They may pay a little more for some food and that sort of thing, but they're not. Okay? So that's the situation we're facing. We're not developing the resources we need in the way we should. We need to fix some of those institutions and do that properly. And even in the best of all worlds, agriculture is not going to get as much water as it used to. In the best of all, in relative terms, in the best of all worlds, it's just not. But that still doesn't say we can't make a whole lot of progress and need to make a whole lot of progress. The basic, simplest solution, and it's deceptively simple because it's easy to say and hard to implement politically. The simple solution is price water at true replacement cost. Now, why do I say that? Well, first thing he says, oh, Ray, we can't do that. Man, we'd have to pay a lot more for water. We couldn't do that. We wouldn't make it. Yeah, you would. It wouldn't go up percentage-wise as much as oil's gone up. And we've all adjusted. It hadn't been easy, but we've all adjusted. I remember I'd give speeches 10 years ago, and people would say to me, I've heard we might have $3 gas. That's going to shut down the economy. I gave speeches 7 years ago, and people said, can you believe it? We're going to be down to $3 gas again. The world's going to be great. And the only difference was they'd seen 5 in between. 3 looks a whole lot better. Looking up from 2, it doesn't look so good. Looking down from 5, it looks pretty good. Okay? We can pay more for water. We can pay the fair cost of what it takes to generate water. And what that does, it does several things. Okay? One is, all of a sudden, it makes more sense to build some pipelines. It makes more sense to build some storage facilities. Desal starts to make more sense. Because we don't have a water shortage. I mean, even in a drought, 70% of the world is covered with water, and almost all the rest of it has water beneath it. So, I mean, in the grand scheme of the world, there's not a water shortage. There's a shortage of creativity and incentives and policy structures and understanding and that sort of thing. But there's not really a shortage of water. There's a shortage of getting water where it needs to be when it needs to be there. It's what there really is. I mean, take Israel as a good example. Since Israel started, their population's increased about 14 times. Their economy's increased about 75 times. It's 65% desert, and they don't have a water problem. They don't have a water problem because they've managed their water well, and they've been innovative. Think what happens when you price it at marginal cost. All of a sudden, the private sector gets involved in looking for solutions, and that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. Right now, if you're a young man and you're smart, or a young lady and you're smart, and you want to be on the Forbes 400 in 10 years, you want to be one of the richest people in the world. What the world's team right now is run a hedge fund, develop some new game, develop some new social media thing. It's not saying develop something new for water. If you priced it properly, the incentive in people's minds is, if I could solve this problem, man, I'd be rich. That creates the incentive. And private sector is good at this stuff. I mean, I see all over, including me, all over the place. Y'all are, we got a private sector company that's our sponsor today. They're getting y'all to pay a lot of money for a little bit of water in a bottle. Okay? In the private sector, they get creative. They figure out ways to make money on things, and that's fine. That's what you want them to do if they're making money by solving your problem. But new technologies would come about. Hydraulic fracturing and all that stuff didn't happen when oil was $35 a barrel, because it's not economically feasible when oil is $35 a barrel. It happens when there's a return on it. And again, we're talking about getting to what it would cost to replace the water, as opposed to free water plus marginal cost of what it cost 50 years ago to build some pipes. I mean, which is what we're paying now. It's not pleasant, but that's the solution that makes conservation really happen. Every time we write a water plan anywhere in this country, a huge percentage of what we're going to do is conservation. We don't conserve that much in reality because it's cheap. Right now, they're counting a lot of stuff as conservation, but to me, this doesn't count as conservation. If you used, I'm going to make up the numbers, if you used 500 gallons of water last year to water your yard, and this year they tell you you can only water it one day a week, and you use 100 gallons, that's not conservation. That's being forced to do it. Voluntary people actually thinking about it. What happened when the price of energy went up? We found out smaller cars worked really well. We adjusted the thermostats. We didn't destroy the world. We adapted. That's what we do. That's what happens in capitalism. If you let the market work in this way, you can bring a lot of energy into it. And yes, it's fundamentally a public good, but you can create the incentives to make the public good work in the way it should be. It's fairly simple, but obviously you're talking about tearing down a lot of history, a lot of philosophy, and a lot of understanding to make that happen. Now, to close this part of it, I don't know what I'm doing on time. If I have time for questions, I'll be happy to. But to close out this part of it and try to end on a happy note, and I hope I've given you a realistic picture. That's what I've tried to do. But to try to end this on a happy note, I have a friend, a very good friend, by the name of Boris Vantayev. Boris was a senior economist for the old Soviet Union, and I first met him when he made a visit to the United States in the late 1980s, and for some reason he'd been reading some of my stuff and he wanted to meet me. After I met him, I think the primary reason he wanted to meet me was he wanted to meet somebody from Texas who would buy him a prime steak. But nonetheless, he wanted to meet me. And so, by the way, that's something else I need to mention on my resume. I forgot to mention this. Sorry about that. The Dallas Morning News this year called me Texas premier economist, that's fine, and barbecue connoisseur. So if you want to know about barbecue in Texas, I'm your guy. And I got a lot of pounds invested in that knowledge. But anyway, first time I had dinner with him was right after the Soviet Union kind of collapsed and that sort of thing, and we had a very pleasant evening. We were talking together, and he said, "You know, Ray, the fundamental difference between communism and capitalism." And I said, "Well, I'd like to hear your perspective on it." And he said, "When things get so bad that it's going to shut everything down, y'all fix it and we don't." And he said, "That's the fundamental difference." And I got to think about it, and he's pretty much right. And by that I mean when something has to happen, it happens. Okay? Think about the debt ceiling. I keep bringing that up, but we've had so many people give speeches, we're not going to vote for the debt ceiling increase. We're not going to increase the debt ceiling. We're not going to pay our bills. We're going to default the government and throw the whole world into chaos because somehow we think that's good. And you know, but what do they do on the day, every time on the day? No matter how many speeches they give, no matter what they do, they increase the debt ceiling because we have to. When you have to do something, you do it. We're going to have to solve the water problem. And so I think we ultimately will. It will come with a lot of gnashing of teeth. Some of you will be resisting some of it. And, you know, that's fine because it's going to be, man, it's not going to feel good. You know, but we will resolve it. We'll resolve it in a way that works just fine. And we certainly can. People say, what about the price of food? Again, the price of oil went up 600%. Inflation went up 1%. Oil's a bigger piece of the cost of everything than water is. You know, we can manage all that stuff. It's not easy, it's not simple, but we can manage it. And that's kind of where we end up. So I leave on that note of optimism, saying that we're getting to a point where I think you will see some positive development occur. I hope you will be a part of the proactive group that helps to make it occur, because your elected officials need to hear from you. We got to have some water resources here. You got to do what we need to do this. You can't use a mindset that's set against it. We've got to try to fix this thing. On that thought, I want to close with a quote, given all the nice credentials that were said about me at the beginning. And he's right over here. By the way, we do you a favor all the time, because the reason economists exist is to give credibility to meteorologists. Anyway, I want to close with a quote. And given that nice introduction, I'd like to close with something from Shakespeare, but I can't. I mean, I grew up in rural East Texas, man. And I live in Waco, or I don't live there anymore. I live in Odessa, but I work in Waco, Texas. And it's often said that Waco's not like yogurt because yogurt has live culture. And oh, isn't that bad? Okay, I want to tell you another story. This isn't the one I was going to tell you, but it reminded me of one. Then I'll tell you the other one. But I was giving a speech one year to the Texas Municipal League. It's mayors and city managers and city council people, folks like that have their trade association in Texas. Big conference in Corpus Christi at their convention center. And the lights that came in were so bright, I couldn't see you. I mean, you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you who was in the audience. And I made that remark about Waco. Well, the next day I was in town, the local convention visitors bureau's folks who had been in Corpus Christi and heard the speech made an appointment to come see me. Okay? And I see them coming down the hall to my office, and they've got this thing with streamers and flowers and balloons, real pretty thing. And I'm like, man, that's nice. I wonder what that's for. Well, as they get closer, it is a yogurt box. And it's stuffed with brochures about cultural attractions in Waco. So I have to tell you, if you ever happen to be on I-35 between Austin and Dallas, you know, you should stop in Waco. Because there's culture in Waco. It all fits in a yogurt box with room left over for balloons and streamers and flowers, but it's there if you look. So anyway, now the quote I'm going to use, and the most culture I can muster, is from Orson Welles. And he was an actor, writer, director, did a lot of cool stuff. He did War of the Worlds on the radio and convinced my grandmother and a bunch of other folks that Martians had landed in New Jersey. He did Citizen Kane, which most people say was the best movie that was ever made. He had a great career. But what I remember about him was late in his life, he had that wonderful, deep, resonant voice, his fabulous voice, and he was rather portly. Now, half of that's described me most of my life, and it's definitely not the voice, okay? I remember one time I was at a friend of mine's house. He was a professor at Baylor, sociologist, just got a new swimming pool, had a pool party. And so we were all in a swimming pool. And he walked up to me and he said, Ray, you know when John Donne said that no man is an island? He said, son, he had never seen you in a swimming pool. But anyway, I went to the doctor. It was anorexia ponderosa. We got it fixed. But anyway, shortly before his death, Mr. Wells did a commercial, probably the best commercial in history. Some of you would be hard-pressed to name 3 commercials from the last Super Bowl, and they spent $1 bazillion on those things. This commercial has been passed down from generation to generation. The man died in 1986. I did a speech to some high school kids about 3 months ago and asked them how many of them knew this commercial. Over half of them did. Very low budget, 10-second commercial. You remember the commercial and the product. It was a commercial for Paul Masson wines. I already see some heads nodding. I can't imitate him in that deep voice. All I do is talk a little slower. But he'd hold the glass of wine, look at it, and in that wonderful deep voice he'd say, at Paul Masson, we will sell no wine. See, everybody remembers it. We will sell no wine before it's time. Now, that commercial always bothered me because Paul Masson sells for $3.75 a gallon. And that's in a restaurant, you know. I mean, I'm serious. They get that stuff in a bottle, it's time, you know. Yeah, Tuesday was a good year, you know. And I really think I think that's where we are right now in terms of water. This is a bad drought. Evelyn gave you a lot of statistics. 11 states, disaster area, 85% of Oklahoma in drought conditions, worst cattle herd since 1951. I mean, and you can name, she gave you a bunch of them. Many statistics you want. Bad drought. She knows better than I am how much longer it's going to last. But we are in a climate cycle that could pose some difficulties for us. But I do think we're getting a deeper understanding. I hope I've helped you gain a deeper understanding today about the economics and the politics and how it all works and what needs to be done. And I think you're people who want to see solutions. You're people who want to be able to preserve the lifestyle that the agrarian society and communities allow. I think you've got your stuff in a bottle, and I think it's time. Thank you very much.